of the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust, and I'm working within the Roots of Rockingham projects, which is part of a bigger initiative called Back from the Brink. So what is Back from the Brink? Well, it was launched in 2017, and it's an initiative to conserve the highest priority threatened species across a series of nationally important landscapes. It's a combination of 7 species-focused conservation partners. So that's Butterfly Conservation, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, Bug Life, Plant Life, Bat Conservation Trust, Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and RSPB. So they're working together collectively under the banner of the Rethink Nature Group, and that partnership is working in association with Natural England. So that's what Back from the Brink is. It's heritage lottery funded, it's aiming at critically threatened species, and it's a partnership project. Right, this shows the project areas across England. So there's 19 different projects. 7 of them are focusing on multiple species, or there's many species within 7 of the projects, and 12 of them have just got a single focal species. And you can see, if you look at my cursor, Rockingham Forest is the area number 6. So that's where the Roots of Rockingham is based. This particular part of Back from the Brink is led by Butterfly Conservation, and locally they're working with Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, Bat Conservation Trust, RSPB and Plant Life, but also working with local partners. That's the Boughton Estates, Forestry England, Natural England, the local Wildlife Trust and the local branch of Butterfly Conservation. This is the project area in more detail. You can see it's a network of woodlands, and it's just to the west of Peterborough. So this conurbation here is Peterborough. And we've got this band of woodlands just to the west and southwest of Peterborough. The woodlands have been grouped by Butterfly Conservation in terms of geographic proximity. So even though it's a network of woodlands, in terms of butterfly migration, which is something they're interested in, then it separates out as 5 different woodland clumps. And that's quite a useful way of thinking about the project area, because the dispersal of reptiles is probably akin to the dispersal of their focal butterfly species. So what does Roots Rockingham aim to do? Well, it's aiming to restore and manage this network of woodland sites. We want to increase the knowledge of distribution and abundance of the target species. So we want to know more about the target species, where they are, how many of them there are. A key aspect of Roots of Rockingham is reintroducing the checkered skipper butterfly. So this is a butterfly species that's been extinct in England, and under this project is being reintroduced to woodlands in the Rockingham area. We also want to raise awareness among local communities about the sites and about the species they contain, because there's no point doing conservation if you haven't got local support. And we also want to enable people to take part in conservation. They can come along to training days, they can take part in surveys, and they can also take part in habitat management. Within the Roots of Rockingham, there's 15 primary species and 11 secondary species. And amongst the primary species, we've got 1 reptile, which is the adder. So the British reptile fauna is fairly small. It's a group of 6 animals, so it's fairly easy to get to grips with. We've got 3 lizard species in Britain and 3 snake species. And the 3 snakes are, the top picture there is the grass snake, the lower picture there is the smooth snake, and the 3rd snake is the adder, which is the one we're particularly interested in Rockingham Forest. Right, a little bit of information about the adder. It's not a particularly big snake. It grows to about 50-55 centimetres, so a little under 2 foot. Females are a little bigger than males. Unusually for reptiles, the males and females are different coloration. So this darker animal here is a male, which is a grey animal with a black zigzag stripe running from the head all the way to the tail. The female is a slightly larger, fatter individual. Females are normally brown with a dark brown zigzag stripe running along the back. I should say that the adder is not a rare animal. This is a rare snake. This is a smooth snake, one of our native snake species. And you can see it's got a very limited distribution, heathlands in Hampshire, Dorset and the Thames Basin. The adder is very different. This is the distribution on the left of the grass snake and on the right of the adder. These are distribution maps taken from an atlas produced by Henry Arnold in 1995. Since then, there's not a lot of change to these overall distributions. However, the devil is very much in the detail. For one thing, these dots on the map represent the presence of a species in a 10-kilometre square. So there may be a lot of animals in a 10-kilometre square, but also there may be very few. Anyway, all of our reptiles are European species. They've got huge ranges over the rest of Europe. And some of them are at the edge of their range in Britain, and some of them are not. And the grass snake is an example of a reptile which is at the edge of its range. You can see as you go further north through Britain, grass snakes get fewer and further between. And one of the reasons that's thought to be is because grass snakes, like most reptiles, lay eggs. The eggs need heat to hatch them out. And as you get further north, it simply gets too cold for the eggs to incubate. So grass snakes are at the edge of their range in Britain. In contrast, the adder is certainly not. The adder is one of the most northerly, if not the most northerly snake species in the world. It just gets into the Arctic Circle. So the whole of the British Isles is well within the global range of the adder. And something else. Yeah, it's probably got one of the largest ranges of any terrestrial snake species in the world. So again, you might be thinking, well, why then is this a priority threatened species within the Roots of Rockingham project? As I said, adders are well adapted to living in northern climes. One of their adaptations is unlike grass snakes, they don't lay eggs. So adders give birth to live young. Typically about 9 or 10 offspring are produced by a female during a year, but it ranges from 3 to 18. They're not very fecund animals, so each female on average probably only breeds once in her lifetime, and they take about 3 or 4 years to reach sexual maturity, which is the significance for a project like Roots of Rockingham, because the Roots of Rockingham project lasts 3 years. So if we wanted to look at changes in adder abundance during that 3-year project, we're unlikely to see any dramatic changes. You really need to be monitoring reptiles in the long term to work out if populations are changing. So going back to these distributions, why are we paying so much attention to the adder? Why is the adder different to the grass snake, for example, or other widespread reptile species? For example, the slow worms. We get slow worms within the Rockingham forest area. They are super abundant, really. Why is the adder different to things like the slow worm and the grass snake? Well, one of the first reasons that they're different is the fact that adders are slightly fussier about their habitat requirements. And this means that they're restricted to smaller patches of habitat. So within a large area of countryside, you can get grass snakes moving all over it, and you might get slow worms occupying large areas of that countryside. But with an adder, you'll find them confined to small habitat patches. What is adder habitat? Well, adders are looking for open, primarily semi-natural habitats that are warm and yet provide cover from vegetation. They're normally found on lighter soils, well-drained soils, so chalk or sandy soils. You rarely get adders on heavy clays. Typical adder habitat is heathland or moorland, where you've got vegetation, but it's low vegetation, and you've certainly got the sunshine reaching ground level. You can find adders in grassland, but it will depend on the structure of the grassland. So if there's a dense sward, but a little scrub, you'll find there's adders there. If it's closely cropped sward, then there'll be nowhere for adders to hide, and you're unlikely to find them. They like warm habitats, so they do well on coastal dune systems and also coastal cliffs. So primarily, the key adder habitats are what I'd call semi-natural or natural habitats. And that's significant because most of the countryside is dominated by either agriculture or developed areas. Adders can't survive well in those particular areas, so again, it makes them a conservation priority, in contrast with something like a grass snake, which does quite well in agricultural land, or a slow worm, which can fare well in all sorts of different habitats, including ones heavily influenced by people. Adders do live on some highly modified habitats. For example, they can be found on some brownfield sites, for example, disused quarries. Once the vegetation gets in there, quarries can be warm, open habitats that are favourable. And also adders will do well on sea walls and embankments of roads and railways. But this is normally in association with other adder habitat areas of the semi-natural kind. So you might find adders on a seawall, but that seawall is probably connected to larger areas of more natural habitat. Right, woodland is also, if you look at a textbook and look at adder habitat, it will tell you that woodland is adder habitat. And that at first seems a bit strange, because I've just pointed out that the key aspects of adder habitat are open areas where sunlight can reach the ground, and clearly in woodland there's a lot of shade. So within a woodland, if you've got extensive shading by the tree canopy, then the habitat is not favourable to adders. The adders are confined to clearings within the woodlands, edges where you get interfaces between trees and open areas. So ride edges are the key aspects of habitat for adders in woodland. So this is a shot of Rockingham Forest, and you can see on the right you've got a ride bordering the path, and beyond the ride there's an open area of tussocky grassland and sedge. And that area receives sunshine, and that area is good adder habitat. Rockingham's quite strange because it doesn't, to my eye, look really like typical adder habitat. And yet within the Rockingham Forest area, or particularly within fine shade woodlands, wherever you've got open areas, you normally have good populations of reptiles, and sometimes that includes adders. And some of these areas are on a clay soil, which again is not typical. They can be quite wet, and so the adders are presumably searching out tiny little areas of raised ground to spend most of their lives, so they can get above the damp ground to get into slightly drier, warmer areas. So even within a woodland area within Rockingham Forest, adder habitat is patchy rather than uniformly spread over woodland. So the way a woodland is managed heavily influences the success of reptiles within woodlands, including adders. So this is another woodland ride. You can see the vegetation is growing right up to the edges of the ride. There's not a great extent of interface between the low vegetation and the taller vegetation. So when you get woodland like this, even though adders may be nearby, they're probably not using this particular microhabitat simply because it's not warm enough, there's no sun getting in there. So woodland can be good habitat for reptiles, but it's the woodland clearings, rides and edges that are the key patches that the reptiles, including adders, are using. So going back to why is the adder different from other reptile species? Well, okay, we've talked about why it's fussier about its habitat requirements. It's also a relatively sedentary species, which means that individuals don't move very far. And adults in particular tend to move back to the same places. They have a home range and they stay within that home range. And if you think about animals that are living in habitat patches, this can sometimes mean that it's quite difficult for an animal to move between one habitat patch and another. They're simply not doing that. They're staying within their own little patch of habitat. Whether that might be an open area within a woodland or a woodland itself is difficult to say, and that's to be determined by this project. But the fact they don't move very much means that they're more of a conservation risk. And finally, adders tend to occur at low population densities. That's in contrast with something like a slowworm. If you've got good habitat with slowworms, you can have hundreds or even thousands of slowworms per hectare. But with adders, the population densities are always much lower. You're talking about a handful of animals per hectare of good habitat. And that means that local populations can be very small. And as we'll talk about later, small populations suffer particular threats. Right, looking a bit more closely at Henry Arnold's atlas, these are dots representing the presence of adders in 10 kilometre squares or hectads. You can see this little area that I've circled. Those 5 10 kilometre squares actually correspond pretty closely with the Rockingham Forest area. So those are the 5 10 kilometre squares, and these are all our project woodlands within those squares. And this sort of emphasises the fact that those dots on maps can be highly deceptive. For example, we've got a patch of woodland here, which is called Bedford Purlieux. And you could imagine that if your population of adders within this woodland, the adders might be at quite low density, but they would tick boxes for being present in 2 10 kilometre squares. So 2 dots on that 10K map could just be from a small population within a single patch of woodland. So within the Roots of Rockingham project, one of the most important things to do is find out where adders are within the project woodlands and where within individual woodlands the adders are, whether they're acting as lots of small isolated populations, or perhaps one larger population, or perhaps a network of interconnected small populations. When we started the project, one of the first things we did was look for existing records of adders. So people make records of a particular fauna and flora, and those records tell you about local distribution. However, as is often the case with reptiles and a lot of other taxa, they're massively under-recorded. So when we started the project, we had about 80 records of where adders were. And you can see these are the project woodlands here, and most of the records are clustered towards the north. That's Bedford Purlieux again, that was the woodland we were talking about. So there's very few records. Has it always been that way? Do these records reflect the fact that adders have never been widely distributed, or do they reflect the fact that they have been widely distributed, but the records are just recording them in a single place? Well, if you look at the historical references to adders, there is a little bit of information. These historical records always have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because people didn't necessarily know a huge amount about reptiles, including adders, in the past. But because the adder is a venomous animal, it is a species of which people take particular interest. So if adders are around, people normally are more likely to make a record of that than some perhaps less significant species. One of the earliest natural histories in Britain is the Natural History of Northamptonshire, and that's by John Norton in 1712. And clearly he wasn't too knowledgeable about reptiles, but he did acknowledge the fact that within Northamptonshire, adders were not very common. If you look at the writings of John Clare, the poet, the peasant poet, who was also living in Northamptonshire, he was actually a little bit more informative. For example, he wrote, "They seem to inhabit high land," which makes sense. I was talking about adders liking well-drained soils and warm places. And he actually named Southey Wood as a spot where they're oftenest seen with us. So he recommended Southey Wood as a place to see adders, and Southey Wood is one of the woodlands within our project area. Another source, a really useful source of historical records on adders, is the life history of British serpents and their local distribution in the British Isles. This was a work produced by Gerald Leighton, who corresponded with naturalists all over the country, trying to find out about adders. He was interested in body size of animals, but also in their local distributions. And the correspondence he was getting back from Northamptonshire pretty much supported what the previous naturalists were saying. For example, one of his correspondents said that they were scarce in Northamptonshire, but they used to be common at one particular location, which is Brampton Wood near Desborough, and that's just to the southwest of our project area. And another comment was between 30 and 40 years ago, the adder was very plentiful in a large wood in Northamptonshire near here. Here was Wansford, and so the large wood is probably Bedford Purlieux, the woodland that we were just talking about on the map. And he was saying that they're still found there, but in reduced numbers. And it's interesting, even in these early writings, there's evidence that the authors generally thought that adders were declining. They were rare, they were in Northamptonshire, and they seem to be declining in numbers. So putting together the historical accounts, I've circled very roughly the project woodlands, and Gerald Leighton, he was talking about Brampton Wood, so there's a population down here. He was talking about a woodland that was probably corresponded with Bedford Purlieux. This red dot is where the poet John Clare was born and lived, so he would have been fairly familiar with this patch of countryside. And he pointed out Southey Wood as an area where there were adders. And he also talked about a couple of cases of possible snake bite up in the Stamford area. But putting this all together, it does look as though adders were always present in the northern part of the Rockingham forest. But since also there's a fairly good record of the south, it's possible they were within intervening woodlands in the past as well. And finally, another, what I have to recognise is now a historical reference, was provided by the local naturalist Ken Blackwell, who's now passed away. And some years ago, I was working on a questionnaire investigation of the status of adders and slow worms nationally. And that involved me corresponding with a lot of local naturalists, finding out their opinions of adder and slow worm populations. And for some reason, there was Ken Blackwell wrote me a letter about adder status in Northamptonshire. And some of the lines in there just seemed to be really summing up the situation very well. So one of the things that Kenneth wrote, he was talking about the adder was not uncommon 50 years ago. Many of the smaller woods and quarries in the area also had small populations, but over the years, the number of sites and animals have declined. So again, Kenneth Blackwell was pointing towards this situation of the fact that where you have small populations, they seem particularly prone to declines and extinctions. Some more recent research work has again cemented this relationship between population size and long-term prospects. A project called Make the Adder Count, again working with volunteer surveyors, was asking volunteer surveyors just to submit the counts of adders that they see at sites that they've visited regularly. So you've got people going out and essentially watching over adders in their local population. And what Emma Gardner found when she analysed the data from these adder counts, she's found that the small populations and large populations seem to be showing different trends. The large populations on average seem to be increasing in numbers. Quite why that is not particularly relevant to what we're talking about. It may simply be because the surveyors are getting to know the sites better. But she also found that the small populations tend to be decreasing in numbers. And in fact, during the course of the study, several of them went extinct. And critically, most adder populations are small. So it doesn't really matter what the large populations are doing. It's really critical what the small populations are doing, because this is where the bulk of our adders are living. And Emma's summary demonstrates that small populations are particularly prone to long-term declines and extinctions. Why might that be? Well, this isn't a situation that's peculiar to adders. It's a situation that's relevant to animal species in general. I think a lot of people are fairly well aware that if you've got a very small population, you're prone to inbreeding, which is just a reduction in the amount of genetic variability. So the more animals you have in a population, the more genetic variability there is. And conversely, in a small population, you've got less genetic variability. And this matters because this genetic variability is the raw material of evolutionary change. So if you lose that variability, a population loses its responsibility to evolve in response to changing conditions. So in the long term, small populations, because they've got less genetic variability, are likely to go extinct. And it's possible that that's what's going on with some adder populations. And the adder, in fact, is a textbook species for a phenomenon called genetic rescue. And this is essentially a genetic rescue is shaking up the gene pool of a population. And as I say, the adder is a textbook case. This is based on a Swedish population of adders that has been studied by Thomas Madsen. And he looked at an isolated population in a place called Smygehuk. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It certainly is Sweden. So it's a relatively small, isolated population. And he was noting that over time, that population was declining. He was also picking up an increased incidence of stillbirths, that's adders being dead when they're born, and also some of these young animals were deformed at birth. So these are all indications of inbreeding and a loss of genetic variability. However, he did something really interesting because he carried out a genetic rescue on this population. What he did is he took 20 males from a larger and more genetically variable population and introduced them to Smygehuk for 4 breeding seasons. After that, he actually managed to catch up 8 of the surviving males and take them home again. But during their 4 years within the Smygehuk population, these males had presumably bred with local female adders. And after that temporary introduction, the population then started to recover. The numbers of animals increased and the numbers of stillbirths and deformities decreased. So the adder is quite an unusual example of a wild population that's suffering from inbreeding, and that you were able to actually rescue that population by mixing up or adding some genetic variability by moving snakes around. Is this something we ought to be doing with UK adder populations? Well, probably not. Interesting though it is, probably not. We do need to pay attention to the genetic aspects of conservation. But if we're talking about the risks to small isolated populations, inbreeding is something that's going to give a long-term impact, before that starts to bite, you're going to get the adverse impacts of stochasticity or variability. And one way that makes an impact is through demographic stochasticity. And all this means is just the natural fluctuations you get in populations anyway. So you can imagine if you've got a population, a very small population fluctuating in numbers, it could fluctuate to extinction. An extreme example would be a population where you only have 2 animals. If those 2 individuals were both the same sex, then their population would no longer be able to breed and would become extinct. So the smaller the population, the greater the risk of extinction through demographic stochasticity. You've also got fluctuations in the environment. An animal like the adder is very dependent on warmth. So in a warm year, they may breed well, but in a really cold year, they may not breed as well. And natural fluctuations like variations in weather patterns, or perhaps just variations in predation levels. If you've got a small population, the more likely that population is to go extinct just due to environmental stochasticity. And on top of that, these factors interact. The bottom line is that the smaller the population, the higher the risk of extinction in the long term through lack of genetic variability, but in the immediate term, just through natural fluctuations. So one of the first things we had to do with the Rockingham area is find out where the adders are, how big the populations are, and what sort of populations they are. Have we got several large populations? Have we got lots of small populations? And to do that, we just needed to increase, or we needed survey effort. We needed to get more records than we'd had through existing biological records. So one of the things we've done through the project is train volunteers in surveys. Adders like warmth, and once you understand the weather conditions that are most likely to attract adders out to bask to raise their body temperatures, you can go out and look for adders basking. Another way of finding adders is to create local microclimates that are warm. And one of the ways we do this with reptile surveys, including adders, is the use of refuges. So here you can see a sheet of onguli. This is compressed bitumen. It's used as a roofing material. It's black, so it heats up when the sunlight falls on it. And adders will gather underneath these things at certain times. And this is someone during one of our survey training days turning over the onguli. You can see he's not doing it with his bare hand. He's using a stick to turn over the onguli. And that's one of the methods we've used to train volunteers in survey for adders. We've had a great response. We've had masses of records coming back from our trained surveyors, but in particular, I'd like to highlight the efforts of Kevin Clark. Kevin has carried out the bulk of the surveys and provided the by far the most number of new records of adders. And a typical survey for Kevin is a day spent in the field, during which time he may walk 10 or 12 miles. So a huge amount of work put into adder surveys by Kevin. Here he is actually indicating an adder, which you can't see. I suppose that just demonstrates how difficult it is to see adders. Some people have a knack for it, some people don't. With training, you can get better, but some people really just have an innate knack for this. One such person is Kevin. We don't normally recommend that people approach adders closely or point towards them. Kevin's just doing this for the purposes of the photograph, just to show there is an adder in habitat here. Right, so what has the survey effort yielded? Well, as I said before we started the project, up until the start of the project, we could only find 83 records of adders within the area. And actually, half of those came from a study. So about half of those records were records coming from the same couple of locations. So really, we probably only got about 40 location records of adders. Since the start of the project, thanks to the work of Kevin and other volunteer surveyors, we've got 286 adder location records. So an increase of at least threefold in adder records, and that's since people have been collecting records back into the 1950s. So that's an incredible achievement. What are the records showing? Well, again, they're showing that the adders are clustered very much to the northern part of the network of woodlands. So here is Bedford Purlieux. That was the woodland we were talking about before. There's a couple of records there, but actually those aren't very recent records. Most of the recent record of adders are confined to a woodland, which is obliterated by these dots, which is fine shade wood. There's also a lot of adder records. These are collected by a local community project, Kingscliff Wild Places, headed up by Charles Tomlin. They've got adders there, so it's not actually part of the Rockingham woodlands, but it is an adjacent population, and we are liaising closely with the Kingscliff Community Project, because it's really important that we don't look at two separate populations. It's really important that adders are actually moving between the two localities and form part of a much larger adder population rather than two relatively small populations. I should also add that some of the records were provided by Brian Laney, a local naturalist, and some of his records have been really interesting, because what Brian has been finding, he's been finding adders on roadside verges here south of Fine Shade, and also there's a patch of woodland here which is Collie Western, but the adders seem to be outside the woods at the moment, and again they're on a roadside verge north of Collie Western. And the reason I say this is encouraging is because it looks as though we've got just an island of isolated adder records, and Kevin Clark came up with the terminology, we've got an adder island. What I'm hoping is the fact that we've also got adders on verges outside the woodland patches. I'm hoping that that's a demonstration of the fact that the adders aren't confined to these patches, but are actually using roadside verges as migration corridors. And if that is the case, then one way of recovering the adder population would be to increase the quality of habitat within these core areas, so that we have a bigger adder population, which will have more animals migrating out to other areas. And in time, hopefully they will be able to colonise neighbouring woodlands, and hopefully recolonise in particular Bedford purlieus, which is woodland where they used to occur, but as far as we can tell, they are no longer present. So what's the Roots of Rockingham project doing? Well, to improve adder habitat, there's a lot of widening of rides going on. Remember I was saying that within the woodlands, the adders are confined to open areas. So where you've got a ride wide between the path and the forestry stands, this is potential reptile habitat. So we've widened rides across 6 kilometres, or 6 kilometres of rides have been widened across 5 sites. Another 12 kilometres of rides are now being managed in a way that allows them to be mown, so that they can be mown to keep them open, rather than scrubbing up and becoming shaded by scrub and bracken. So hopefully that'll be another 12 kilometres of rides that will be reptile habitat. We're also planning to create 2 clearings within fine shade woodlands. We're talking about clearings of about a hectare area. And Susanna O'Riordan has made an input to the forest design plan, so that these clearings are created on a rotational cycle. So hopefully there will always be little clearing areas within the woodland, and hopefully these will be adder hotspots, really high quality habitat for adders within fine shade wood. Other things that are being done, well, I talked about the fact we're engaging volunteers in survey and running training days. Within these back from the Brink projects, there's a lot of emphasis on public outreach, and that's important because you can't have conservation being effective if you haven't got local public support. And that's particularly significant for a species like the adder, which is a venomous reptile and may otherwise not have public support. One of the nice things about fine shade woods is there's a classroom there, there's abundant reptiles, so it's a great place to run a walk or a talk about reptiles, to educate people about reptiles. So people can't actually pick up adders, but they can go out and look for adders. They can look for things like slow worms, pick them up, have a good close hand look at the animals. And it does seem that with outreach projects, the hands-on element does seem to make a difference in changing people's attitudes and into how much they learn about the target species. So obviously you can't handle an adder, but you can handle a slow worm and learn about adders in the process. The project has also run a series of workshops, running about 1 workshop a year, and these are aimed at land managers. So what we're doing is talking to people who are managing woodland sites and stressing the importance of, in particular, open habitat areas. We're running the workshops as a joint partnership venture, and this is one of the advantages of the Back from the Brink project. So instead of running a workshop for landowners on just adders, and then having them come back next week and maybe learn about the plants in the wood or learn about the bats. All the taxonomic specialists can get together and give presentations to the landowners. So the landowners can come along, and in one day they can learn about all the taxonomic species of importance within the woodlands and how to manage woodlands to benefit these critical species. And fortunately, it turns out that even though we're dealing with different taxonomic groups, we're dealing with plants, we're dealing with bats, we're dealing with birds, we're dealing with reptiles, there is this common theme that within a woodland, the best bits of habitat are the open areas and the interfaces. So we're all very much stressing the importance of having open areas of habitat within the woodland to create a sort of a network of open areas within a matrix of woodland. That does seem to be key to wildlife benefits of woodland areas. So where's the project going next? Well, we're continuing to restore, extend and connect patches of adder habitat within fine shade woodlands. And hopefully that will carry on beyond the project. We're talking to the Kingscliff Community Group, and we're looking at options for maybe linking woodlands with more favourable habitat. We still need to get a better handle on adder population status, so we're very much hoping that the surveys are going to carry on. And also, Liz Morrison from from the North Hants Amphibian and Reptile Group is starting to take samples from the adders so that the genetic structure of the population can be considered. Remember, I said that in the long term, adder populations may suffer from inbreeding. We want to try and find out more about the genetic health of the population, and in particular, whether we're dealing with lots of geographically isolated populations or whether it's acting as one big population, and the genetics should tell us something about that. So just to summarise, Rockingham Forest is an important area of adder habitat, both locally and also nationally. Within the Midlands, and particularly in the East Midlands, adders are scarce, and the Rockingham Forest woodlands are the only area that supports the adder. The project is improving the quality of the habitat and increasing the extent of adder habitat within the woodlands. It's also engaging people to take part in the project through surveys and through outreach. And hopefully we're developing a legacy, which is particularly important for a species like the adder. As I said before, adders aren't very fecund species, so increases in population aren't going to be particularly rapid. Adders also take a long time to reach sexual maturity. So an adder will take 3 or 4 years before it becomes sexually mature, and the project only lasts 3 years. So we're very much hoping that the project surveys will be picked up by Northamptonshire Amphibian and Reptile Group, and that will become a focal interest that they can carry on as a volunteer group. And hopefully the work on adders in Rockingham Forest will provide a model for adder conservation naturally. It's certainly a really interesting area. You know, the genetic and the demographic aspects and interplay between those is going to be critical for conservation of all animal species in future. So hopefully we can run a model project not only for adder conservation, but other species with relatively low mobility as well. Okay, thank you very much. That completes the presentation.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, John. We've got some questions in the chat already, so I'll start looking through those now. And if anyone else has any questions, please do pop those in the chat or raise your hand as we went through before, and then we'll start working our way through them now.
Holly, I've grouped the questions and sent them in an email, so if you just check your email, they're grouped by category.
Yes. So John, Katie was asking, does the management on roadside verges include larger A roads as well?
Well, the project is not, we don't have the scope to manage the roadside verges. That's the local authority that does that. But as it happens, the adders are on the verges of A roads. And there are 2 A roads that cross the project area, and whether animals can actually cross those roads is going to be critical to future success. When we're talking about this island, one way of breaking out of that island is having animals cross roads. Adders are probably unlikely to be able to move over the surface of an A road, but nevertheless reptiles are quite good at getting under roads through other means, for example through culverts and so on. So the main roads are probably going to be barriers to dispersal, but the verges to those roads provide some sort of linear habitat that the animals are using. And hopefully the roads are not complete barriers to dispersal going transversely rather than up and down the road.
Well, thank you. Pierce was asking, can adders do parthenogenesis, so virgin birth?
Not that I'm aware of. No, not that I'm aware of. I know parthenogenesis has popped up unexpectedly in some reptile species, but not the adder as far as I'm aware.
Oh, and then Amy was asking, when you're talking about ride management before, what is ride scalloping?
Oh, right. A scalloping is just talking about making an indentation into the woodland. So rather than have, because most plantation woodland is planted regularly, so you'll get a crop of trees with a hard edge. What scalloping is doing is creating a little bay of open area at the edge of that woodland. So rather than having a straight edge, you've got a scalloped edge. So that's what scalloping is, it's creating edges. And that's good because it increases the area of open habitat, but also because it's a scallop that's protected on most of its sides by trees, they actually create very warm microhabitats. So if you've got a scallop that's got on a south-facing edge of a block of woodland, that not only creates open habitat, but it's very warm open habitat, which is great for reptiles, great for plants, great for invertebrates. So much better than a straight edge.
Great, thank you. Eliza was asking, how wide are the rides?
Completely variable. I think if I showed you in the presentation, I showed you an overgrown ride. I mean, that ride was barely a couple of meters wide. And the ride I showed you that was good adder habitat was probably, I would say, about 20, 25 meters wide.
Great, thank you. Wendy is asking, how long do adders live?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think with most reptile populations, you tend to get a few outliers. So there's a few animals that live much, much more than all the others. So as we're saying, most females only breed about once in their lifetime. So most adders are probably only living till about 6 or 7 years old. But certain individuals can obviously live longer than that. And one adder ecologist, Tony Phelps, he published an article in British Wildlife called Beyond Hypothesis. And that was based on his studies of tracking individual snakes. And he was able to work out how long some of them were living. And he concluded that some of his adders were actually getting, I think, as old as 20 years old. So I think potentially they can live quite a long time, maybe as much as 20 years. But in practice, most of them are only getting to be about 6 or 7 years old.
Right, it's amazing. Helen was asking earlier when you were showing the distribution maps, does the lack of dots on the map mean that the species isn't present there, or is it just that no one's checked?
Well, that's a good point, but it is one of those age-old questions that always goes in biological recording. If you've got a presence, then they're definitely there, but if you've got an absence, is it because they're really not there or because no one's looking? And I think with the adders now, I think because we understand the habitat quite well, and we know places that are worth looking at and places that are not, I think those distribution maps probably are pretty accurate. Yeah. In fact, I do know people that have looked for reptiles in the Midlands, and it is quite peculiar because if you find habitat that looks suitable for reptiles in part of the country like East Anglia, for example, you'll normally find reptiles there. Yet curiously, you can find very similar habitat in the Midlands where there's all those gaps, and even though the habitat looks right, for some reason the animals really just don't seem to be there.
Thank you. Ava, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. When I used to work in environmental health in Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, there was an area, a long strip of old established terraced housing, and the gardens at the back led on to a scrubby area, we'll say. And there used to be adders coming into the gardens, quite a lot. And it was very disturbing to people who got toddlers or crawling babies and things. And the established method of keeping them out was to put creosote-soaked rope across each garden. Now, I never knew that there was any scientific backing to this, And creosote is now not regarded as a good thing to have about. Can you tell me what is now regarded as a good method of keeping them out?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should say that that location is probably quite unusual because you've got houses bordering onto adder habitat. And as I said before, adder habitat is normally fairly natural rather than modified by humans. So in most cases, adders aren't going to be coming into gardens anyway. If you're lucky enough to live in part of the world where your garden abuts some nice natural habitat, then there's a couple of suggestions I should make. The first thing is just to keep your garden as bare of cover as possible. So mow the lawns, don't grow any plants. A lot of people seem to do that in their gardens anyway, have nothing in it. That is a way of discouraging reptiles in. And another very good way is keep chickens. Chickens will scratch around, they'll remove cover, and they will eat and deter reptiles. So yeah, keeping chickens would work really well. I've never heard of the creosote business. I've got no idea if that works. So curious to hear about that. But I think chickens are probably much more reliable. And as I said, for most people, it's not really an issue. It's only rare circumstances that you get adders coming into gardens. And moreover, because adders don't move very far, it's normally pretty clear what parts of the country have adders and what parts of the country don't. So it's not going to be a typical garden visitor to a typical garden. It's highly unusual to get adders in gardens.
Thank you for that, John, and Ava for your question as well. Katie's been asking in the chat, have you done any tagging of the adders to track their movements?
No, we haven't, and that would be a really useful thing to do, to find out whether adders are sort of confined to particular open areas of the woods, or whether they're moving about within the woodlands or moving even beyond the woodlands. And we could find that out by radio tracking, but that would involve handling the animals. And the surveys that we've done have been very much involving volunteers. We didn't think that radio tracking was the sort of thing that you could engage volunteers to do. In actual fact, some volunteers would be quite capable of it, but nevertheless, for a volunteer project, we're just advocating observation from a distance rather than actually any handling of adders. So I'm not saying it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. In the future, maybe there will be a tagging project to see how adders are using the local habitat.
Okay, thank you.
And such studies are really useful. I mean, Nigel Hand has done a lot of studying of adders through radio tracking, and that demonstrates really nicely the sort of areas of patches of habitat that adders are using. For example, where you get open areas, they're very unwilling to cross open areas, and that comes out really clearly through the radio tracking.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions as well about stillbirths in Sweden. Amy was asking, does the whole litter die, or is it just weaker individuals or runts?
I really don't know. I think it's usually, there's often when reptiles are born, there may be an animal, a runt that doesn't make it. And I think what happens with inbreeding, you just get an increased proportion. So it's the numbers of stillborn with each litter on average is going up. And for the life of me, I can't remember what the figures were, but you're getting more stillborns in the inbred population.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I'm just reading a message from Stephen, which is related to the stillbirths. Saying, with the inbreeding issue, is it a concern that if small populations increase in size, it could result in a genetic bottleneck?
Yeah, it could do. Yeah. I'm not a geneticist, so I can't comment other than say yes, it could do. Yeah, it's one of the hazards of small population sizes. You lose that genetic variability, and that's what bottlenecking is.
Yeah, thank you. And was asking, what's the legacy of the project? Will adders continue to be conserved after the end of the project? Yeah,
Susanna O'Riordan, the project officer, she's made inputs to the forest design plan. So in future, the woodland should be managed more sympathetically for wildlife in the long term. And we're also hoping that the volunteer element continues. For example, the North Hants Amphibian and Reptile group, for them, fine shade is a great resource to have on their doorstep. It's not only good for adders, it's good for other reptile species. It's interesting because there's palmate newts there, which are a bit of a rarity locally. So hopefully the project has just really sort of thrown a spotlight on the significance of the fine shade population, but hopefully that stimulus will encourage a group to carry on doing surveys. And that's critical because, like I said, we're not going to be able to assess changes in adder population status within a 3-year project, because that's the same length as the generation time of the reptile. So you need to be in there for the long term to see if anything happens.
Yeah. Helen was asking, what do adders eat? Is there anything specific that they go after?
Yeah, their main food is small mammals, so particularly things like voles are the main prey, but they will eat other things as well. Small adders probably eat small reptiles. They also eat fledgling birds occasionally, and occasionally even amphibians. So mainly small mammals, but they will eat other things if the opportunity arises.
Well, thank you. Julie, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask your question and unmute yourself? I can't hear you at the moment, Julie. You're still muted. Hang on, I'll see if I can.
Is that, am
Yeah,
I?
there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Right, my question is, 2 questions. I've got adders in my back garden, which is kind of rough fields that go onto a common. There's a collapsed corrugated sheep shelter, which I'm guessing the adders really like.
Yeah.
When is the best time of year to remove the corrugated panels, which I will leave 1 panel for them, but at the moment there's maybe 6 and it's a real mess. But I thought there's probably a good time to move them and a bad time to move them, or not?
Well, I mean, if they're using the panels, then there's going to be no perfect time, but I would guess that the winter is the best time, because during the active season, you might get individual animals relying on a particular sheet of corrugated iron as their den for the season. Yeah. So to move the corrugated iron during the active season would probably disrupt what they're doing. If you remove it in the winter, it's probably going to have less of an effect. So the active period, the first adders start emerging very early in the year, maybe as early as February, but at that time of year, they're not really using refuges, they're sitting out in the open. So from about May till about September, they'll be potentially under the corrugated iron. If you wait to the middle of the winter and move it, that's probably the best time.
Thanks. And maybe a month ago, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of adders, and a lot other people around here just haven't seen any, but I've seen them in a bluebell wood, which was almost a bluebell blue, this adder. It was a very big adder, and that one was very passive. And I've seen quite a few on the coast path. I'm in Pembrokeshire, but recently in my garden, there was one that was very aggressive to me, which was quite shocking because none of the other adders I've seen have been like that. And this one really raised its head and was hissing at me. And I wondered if I'd taken it unawares or if they were young or something around. I wondered just what triggers that particular behaviour.
Well, there's no parental care with reptiles. So once the female's given birth, the babies will all be independent. And they may hang around the mother simply because the mother's sitting in a nice warm place to bask, but the mother won't actually protect the babies.
Okay.
So it won't be that. I think probably what it is that you took the animal by surprise, because in general, their first defence is not to attack. The first line of defence is to keep still and hope nobody sees them. And if something then comes closer, they will try and get away, and if they can't get away, then they will potentially strike. Yeah. So maybe you took this one by surprise, which you had no escape options. The other thing is they do vary a bit in temperament, and I think sometimes this can lull people into a false sense of security. And it does seem to be my experience that some of the female adders seem to be more aggressive than the males, and it also varies according to the season. Yeah. Early in the year, for example, when males have come out of hibernation, they're pretty dozy and pretty docile. Once they start looking for mates, they're more aggressive, and females just tend to be more aggressive than males anyway. So I think it's partly individual variation, but mostly simply because that animal didn't have any escape option.
Okay, that's fabulous. Thank you very, very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, John, as well. So that's the end of our virtual meetup today.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes,
I forgot my acknowledgement slides. Can I just talk about that?
Yeah, go for it. Do you want to
share? Okay, I'd like to thank the volunteer surveyors and naturalists, particularly the late Kenneth Blackwell, Kevin Clark, who's done a lot of the surveys, but also Barry Galpin, Angela Julian, Brian Laney, and Charles Tomalin and the Kingscliff Wild Places, and Sam Betts. If you want to know more about the project, then contact Susanna O'Riordan or Elizabeth Morrison at Butterfly Conservation. I'd also like to thank Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, in particular Jim Foster, and the network of amphibian and reptile groups who gave us survey refuges and general support. And if you want to get involved locally, there are local groups. So there's an amphibian and reptile group in Northamptonshire and another one based in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thanks John. And we'll send around links as well to you all so you can find your local amphibian and reptile group in a follow-up email. So thank you John for taking the time to come and talk to us today. It was a really interesting talk. And thanks everyone else for joining us. Hope you found that interesting. Apologies we didn't make it through all of the questions. There were quite a lot of them today. I'll send around a bit more information in the follow-up email so you can see that. So yeah, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.